1966, Senator William Fulbright stood on the Senate floor and called South Vietnam what no American official had ever said out loud: an American brothel. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was sitting right there. He denied it. The Pentagon denied it. But here's what the official records show. By the end of the war, there were between 300,000 and 500,000 women in South Vietnam's sex trade. The venereal disease rate among American troops was the highest of any war in U.S. history. In the military, they weren't just aware of it, they were running some of the brothels themselves. This is the story of how prostitution became an unofficial weapon for morale, how it shaped an entire generation of soldiers, and the consequences that lasted decades after the last helicopter left Saigon. To understand what happened in Vietnam, you have to understand the numbers. In 1960, before the major American troop buildup, Saigon was a city of about 500,000 people. By 1968, it had exploded to 4 million. 10 million Vietnamese had been displaced by the war, and many of them ended up in the cities. When American troops began pouring in after 1965, an entire shadow economy emerged around them. A 1968 investigation by Maclean's magazine found 30,000 women working in over 1,400 bars across just the Saigon, Gai Dinh, and Ben Hoa areas. The South Vietnamese government's official count of professional prostitutes was 200,000, but historians estimate the actual number was far higher. But here's what made Vietnam different from any previous war. The military didn't just tolerate this. In some cases, they organized it. In 1966, roughly 1/3 of General Harry Kennard's 21,000 troops in the 1st Cavalry Division had contracted venereal disease. 1/3. The problem was so severe, the local village elders approached the army with a proposal. Let us build a regulated brothel complex inside your perimeter. The army agreed. Time magazine called it Disneyland East, a 25-acre compound where 100 to 300 soldiers visited daily. Similar operations existed at Lai Khe and Pleiku. At Pleiku Sin City, GIs could purchase a ticket for 300 piastres, about $2.50, which gave them up to 3 hours with any of the women. The military's official position was that they suppressed prostitution, but a January 1972 headline in the New York Times told a different story. U.S. now admitting prostitutes to some of its Vietnam bases. Every American soldier who served in Vietnam was entitled to 1 week of rest and recuperation. They could choose from destinations like Bangkok, Hong Kong, Manila, Taipei, Tokyo, Sydney, or Hawaii. The soldiers had another name for it: I&I, intoxication and intercourse. Pan Am operated the airlift on a no-profit government contract. From 1966 onward, they flew over 800,000 round-trip passengers. And while the official purpose was rest, what actually happened was an open secret. Lloyd Lofthouse, a U.S. Marine and Vietnam veteran, later wrote about his experience. I don't know anyone in my unit who expressed the slightest bit of interest in Vietnam's culture or history. When we went on 5 days of R&R, most of us were interested in only one thing: getting drunk and getting laid. In Bangkok, soldiers could hire a guide for roughly $72 per week. By the late 1960s, the city had an estimated 50,000 bar girls. This wasn't an accident. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara reached an agreement with the Thai government. American R&R facilities would be built in Thailand. In exchange, the U.S. would fund economic development projects. Within a decade, Thailand had over 20,000 brothels. Pattaya Beach transformed from a quiet fishing village into one of the world's most notorious red light districts. The infrastructure built for American soldiers never went away. It just changed customers. The venereal disease rates in Vietnam were staggering. In World War II, the rate was about 43 cases per 1,000 troops per year. In Korea, it jumped to 184. In Vietnam, it reached 262 cases per 1,000 troops annually, the highest of any American conflict. For most of the war, VD was the #1 diagnosis in the US military. Roughly 90% of cases were gonorrhea. One Navy aircraft carrier reported a rate of 582 per 1,000, meaning more than half the crew was infected in a single year. Now here's what made the situation even worse. 88% of infected soldiers reported that they had received VD education before deployment. They knew the risks, they didn't use protection anyway. And then there was the myth that terrified every soldier in Vietnam, the Black Siph. The rumor spread through every unit. There was a strain of syphilis, completely incurable, that soldiers could catch in Vietnam. If you got it, you were shipped to a secret island and never allowed to return home. Your family were told you died in combat. The Army never confirmed the Black Siph existed, but they never denied it either. Decades later, medical historians found no evidence that it was real, but the fear of it was real, and it did nothing to slow the VD rates. The women suffered even more. By the end of the war, an estimated 80% of Vietnamese sex workers had contracted some form of venereal disease. Many received no treatment at all. Now, this is where the story gets complicated, because prostitution in Vietnam wasn't all exploitation. It wasn't all tragedy. For many soldiers, these relationships provided something the military couldn't: human connection. Some veterans described their experiences in surprisingly tender terms. They talked about girlfriends, not prostitutes. They talked about brief moments of normalcy in the middle of abject chaos. A few fell in love. Roughly 8,000 marriages between American servicemen and Vietnamese women were officially approved during the war. Richard Marcinko, who later founded SEAL Team 6, wrote in his memoir about the stress relief that came from these encounters. He called it a little piece of heaven in the middle of hell. But there was a darker side to this comfort. The same bars and brothels that offered escape also offered drugs. By 1971, Army medical officers estimated that 43% of soldiers had used heroin at least once. 51% had used marijuana. Between 1966 and 1969, the military distributed 225 million amphetamine tablets to troops in Vietnam. Now, the Viet Cong, they understood exactly what the bar district represented. They recruited women as intelligence sources. A lonely soldier might tell his girlfriend about troop movements, upcoming operations, or defensive positions. Some bar girls were feeding information directly to Charlie. Oh, and then there were the pregnancies, the abortions, the Vietnamese women who contracted diseases from American soldiers and had no access to treatment, the women who were beaten by their employers or arrested by South Vietnamese police for crimes their customers had paid for. For every soldier who found comfort, there was a woman whose life was destroyed. Most of these women, they didn't choose this life. They were pushed into it. Lilai Hayslip, who survived the war and later wrote a memoir called When Heaven and Earth Changed Places, described what happened to Vietnamese women. We were caught between two armies, and neither one saw us as human. The women in Saigon's bars came from all over South Vietnam. War widows, refugees from bombed villages, women who had been raped and cast out by their families, teenage girls sold by desperate parents. The going rate was as little as $2 per transaction. Bar owners took a cut of everything. Many women were trapped in debt bondage, unable to leave even if they wanted to. And Vietnamese society offered no mercy. A woman who had worked in the bars was considered ruined. Even if she escaped the trade, she faced lifelong stigma. Her family might refuse to take her back. No respectable man would marry her. When Saigon fell in 1975, the new communist government rounded up women who had worked with Americans. Between 1975 and 1985, Over 14,000 prostitutes in Ho Chi Minh City were sent to re-education camps. Now there's one more consequence to this story: the children. Historians estimate between 25,000 and 100,000 children were born to American fathers and Vietnamese mothers during the war. They were called Amerasian. In Vietnamese, they were called Con Lai, mixed blood, or worse, Bù Doi, the dust of life. After the American withdrawal, these children became targets. The communist government saw them as living reminders of American imperialism. They were denied education, jobs, and basic rights. Black Amerasians, children of African American soldiers, faced double discrimination. In 1970, the United States Department of Defense issued a statement that still shocks people today. The care and welfare of these unfortunate children has never been and is not now considered an area of government responsibility. It took 17 years for that to change. In 1987, Congress passed the Amerasian Homecoming Act, co-sponsored by Senator John McCain. The law allowed Amerasians to immigrate to the United States based on their appearance alone. No DNA test required, no proof of paternity needed. By 2009, roughly 25,000 Amerasians had immigrated to America, bringing 60 to 70,000 family members with them. The approval rate was 95%. But here's the bitter truth. Only 3% of those Amerasians ever successfully contacted their American fathers. The irony? After the Homecoming Act passed, Amerasians suddenly became valuable. Families who had rejected them for years now claimed them as tickets to America. An estimated 17% of admitted family members were fraudulent. What happened in Vietnam wasn't unique to that war. Similar patterns emerged in World War II in Japan and Korea, and continue today around military bases and carriers worldwide. But Vietnam was different in scale. The sex trade became so intertwined with the war effort that it shaped diplomacy, public health, international relations, and the lives of hundreds of thousands of people on both sides. Randy Floyd, a Vietnam veteran interviewed in the documentary Hearts and Minds, said it best.
I think Americans have tried, we've all tried very hard to escape what we've learned in Vietnam, to not come to the logical conclusions of what's happened there. You know, the military does the same thing. You know, they don't realize that people fighting for their own freedom are not going to be stopped by just changing your tactics, you know, and adding a little more sophisticated technology over here, improving the tactics we used last time, not making quite the same mistakes. You know, I think history operates a little different than that, and I think that those kind of forces are not going to be stopped.
We've all tried very hard to escape what we have learned in Vietnam. I think Americans have worked extremely hard not to see the criminality that their officials and their policymakers exhibited. This is part of that story. It's uncomfortable, it's complicated, and it matters. If you want to understand what really happened in Vietnam, subscribe for more stories like this one.